So today's topic that I'm going to go in some details, and there's some aspects that I will not be able to cover, and I'm going to cover those during my plenary talk on Friday, I believe. This is more of a workshop, so we're going to go into some aspects in some detail. I will try to leave some of the formalism in terms of quantum theory interpretations for Friday, and really today give more of a standard approach, and then quickly, or soon after, switch to perennial philosophy and monistic schools, primarily from India. So just jumping right into it, I call this the amazing hypothesis. What I propose is an uncompromising view of the fundamental nature of consciousness. I call it uncompromising because, in fact, the physicalist paradigm that has prevailed Western science is also uncompromising. It is taken as a dogma that there is only external reality, that there is no role for consciousness, and even more, that there is no higher being, no universal consciousness. This is taken as a dogma. In the West, it was not always the case. It certainly was not the case at the time of Newton, when Newtonian physics started. But it has prevailed to the point that now it is an uncompromising view, in the sense that a dialogue is not even permitted. So, counter to that, I'm giving an uncompromising view of the fundamental nature of consciousness. I would say that this view will turn out to be the new paradigm of science. If we can see a little bit into the future, it looks like that will be the case. And conferences like this are pointing to that direction. It is based on what I hold as the amazing hypothesis. It is amazing because it is simple and at the same time all-encompassing. Underlying universal consciousness operates at every level of reality. At every level. Not some levels and not in some other levels. At every level. It is founded on the fundamental I awareness. The nature of fundamental consciousness is the I awareness. I am aware of myself in a universal way. And through a series of steps that are particularly well outlined and understood in Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism, which I will talk a little bit about today, through the application of fundamental principles, it manifests and ultimately becomes the universe we know and we live in. Now you may say, well, this sounds like a theory. But actually, this, what may appear as theoretical knowledge today, has been the experience of sages for many centuries. And I think today, in the West, I'm speaking primarily to the Western mind, we have to understand that these experiences were not just fairy tales. They came out of deep understanding of the nature of the universe and the role of humans in the universe. It applies at all levels, gives rise to the complementarity between object and subject. This is actually now where quantum theory can play a big role. Because going back, as I say here in the subtitle, does quantum theory have something to say? And the answer is yes. Quantum theory has something very important to say about what I'm proposing here. In the unfoldment of the universe, qualia play a fundamental role as they give rise to all levels of subjective experience. And I will develop a little bit the idea of qualia. And finally, connection to ancient monistic wisdom systems becomes natural. there is this gap between Western science and Eastern philosophies. And I would say actually not just Eastern philosophies, but philosophies in general. Because also Plato's philosophy and most of the ancient Greek schools were saying similar things. But then they were forgotten. So the link with monistic wisdoms will become more apparent. So here is a general diagram. It's a bit crowded, but please bear with me. And this is not a linear relationship. What I have to emphasize, it's not linear in space, and it's not linear in time. Because the emanation out of universal consciousness doesn't even take a second. It just happens like that. It's all encompassing and simultaneous. Time has not even arisen yet. So out of the deep I-ness, which of course is being awareness of bliss or Satchitananda, being awareness and bliss. This is the fundamental nature of the I consciousness, which I call undivided wholeness, through fundamental mathematics. You get universal principles, and we will discuss those principles more on Friday. And particularly, you get the object-subject split. When the object-subject split, this is the beginning of the emanation of the universe. Up to this point, and again, it's not a linear process, there's only I consciousness. There's just the beginning, glimmering sense of a division. The object has not taken place yet. There's only the I awareness. And John Hagelin yesterday actually described at that level the various levels of consciousness, the God consciousness, universal consciousness, etc., etc. So all of these are encompassed here. Notice here the term fundamental mathematics. What I believe is that the mathematics that eventually is used over here to explain the universe, which we use in partial differential equations and dynamical equations, etc., is not as fundamental as the original mathematics, which is based on principles that operate at every level. So actually, this fundamental mathematics is where numbers have not arisen yet, when there's only, if you permit, 0 and 1, nothingness and identity. That's the kind of fundamental mathematics I'm talking about. And nothingness and identity are the same. And out of this fundamental deep mathematics, you get universal principles, and eventually you get the object-subject split. This is still before, quote-unquote, the Planck dimensions of space-time. Space-time has not arisen yet. Eventually you get the intellect, the ego, the mind, and when you get the intellect, then mathematics and physics, as we know today, begins to develop. And eventually you describe the universe in terms of systems and objects. As you go down this way, you get increased simplicity. It becomes simpler. But simple is not low level. It's all-encompassing. As you go here, you get increased complexity. And eventually, you get the myriad of objects in the universe, and perhaps myriads of universes that come out of universal consciousness. If you want to put it in words, here is the same thing. Undivided wholeness, I-ness, begins to create subject-object split. How? Through assuming limitations out of its infinite free will. Infinite free will. Infinite power. So how can universal consciousness manifest the world? By taking on limitations. Self-imposed limitations. In physics, we have the analogy of symmetry breaking. Until you have symmetry breaking, there's total symmetry. There's no forces of nature. If you like, all forces of nature are unified. When you begin to have a symmetry breaking, then going this direction is different from going in this direction. And that's the beginning of manifestation of the object. When I see something out there, it's out there and here. It's actually quite very simple if you think about it. And I believe, I suspect, that at the core of the universe, there must be some fundamental simplicity. And out of that fundamental simplicity, you get these myriads of objects that we admire. But they're all part of universal consciousness. This is the amazing hypothesis, because it's so simple. In fact, it is so simple that we ignore it all the time. We take it for granted, right? Ever since you were born, ever since I was born, I knew I existed. Does anybody have to prove that to you? So, these universal principles, and we will discuss them more in detail again later on, springing out of fundamental mathematics, the ground of all being, sub-space-time, sub-plane, below plane. There's no space-time yet. You get the quantum and eventual space-time manifests as qualia. From that point on, it is a subjective experience that begins to take place. Qualia. Primal subject and primal nature then manifest. Not the individual ego, but the primal subject. What in Sanskrit is called Purusha. And the primal nature, Prakriti. So you get the position of the primal subject and primal nature. And eventually you get the intellect, the ego, and the mind. Here is the big sir or madam, the ego, all of us. We're all enshrouded by the ego. Enshrouded by the ego. We have taken layers and layers of identity. It is false identity. It's the ego. The ego is the greatest enemy of humanity. You may say, wait a second. Why do you say that? How can I exist? The ego is your greatest enemy. It's my greatest enemy. It's the one that causes all the ills in the world. The enemy is not out there. The enemy is inside. But also, the great friend is inside. The friend is inside. Developing ordinary mathematical theories of the universe, and through psychosomatic, what John von Neumann called psychosomatic elements, you get the physical universe. Now, what we believe in the West is the other way around. We say, from here, eventually you get this. Doesn't work that way. We have reversed the process. So, consciousness. Here is 17th century idea of consciousness. My source, Wikipedia, right? Might as well. So, what is consciousness? Consciousness, we're not going to go through all the theories of consciousness. There are other experts in the room. More experts than I am in the philosophy of consciousness, etc., etc. But basically it's the subjectivity, the awareness, the sentience, and sometimes we mix these terms. We call awareness of an object we call consciousness. I think that's how, in fact, Stu Hammer is using it. When he says consciousness, it really means conscious awareness of something else. But I'm using consciousness in a more fundamental sense. And to differentiate, I usually will put a capital C when I refer to universal consciousness, and small c for the various types of consciousness. Anyway, there's awareness, sentience, the ability to experience or to feel, wakefulness, having a sense of identity. In the Blackwell Companion of Consciousness, anything that we are aware of at a given moment forms part of our consciousness, making conscious experience at once the most familiar and most mysterious aspect of our life. the most familiar, but it's also the most mysterious. And it is so familiar that we tend to sweep it, as we say, under the rug. We take it for granted. Do I have to prove to you that you know you exist? It's ridiculous. You know it, right? From the time you're born until your time to die, from the time I'm born till the time I die, I know I exist. I don't have to prove it. So why are we even arguing about all of that? This sense of identity of your existence is the same now as it was when you were 1 year old. Same. In fact, sometimes when I look in the mirror and I see myself as different, I say, what has happened here? I feel the same way as when I was little, right? In fact, I remember when I was little, people would address me as a little kid, and I was saying, what are you talking about? I'm not a little kid. I knew I had a wisdom, and every little kid, so-called little kid, knows that he or she has infinite wisdom. I would look at the stars and say, I know the stars. But I couldn't communicate with everybody around me because I was a little kid. And they would say, oh, pat me on the head, you know, like happens here in India. We take care of our kids, right? But actually, we don't understand that they are as infinitely wise as we are. They know, and perhaps sometimes even more than we do, their sense of identity. That never leaves us. But we sweep it under the rug, and we say the most familiar and most mysterious aspect of our lives, we take it for granted. And by taking it for granted, we become more and more separate from our own nature. And one day we wake up and I say, oh my God. And then we try to find God out there and say, God, help me. God never left us. Who is God after all? I don't want to get into political, religious discussions, but usually God is placed out there to separate humans. Right? That's what God is. But the true God is the I consciousness that the masters of Shaivism and Vedanta call Atman, the self. And they said, Parabrahman, Paramatma, and Atma are the same. Your own sense of self is the same as universal self. End of discussion. Now, easy to say, hard to experience. Why? Because out of her infinite free will, consciousness has taken all these cloaks, like I'm wearing, a cloak, a shirt. And in this cartoon, which is actually very, very interesting, 17th century, if you read it, the central point here is Deus. Deus in Latin means God. So in their view, in the 17th century, consciousness was centered around God consciousness. And eventually, all of this, by the way, stuff is qualia. They were talking about qualia back in the 17th century. They were right on. So this simplistic diagram is actually quite good. Now, today we have the riddle of consciousness, the hard problem. It is either very hard or it is very easy. You take your choice. The hard problem is the problem explaining how and why we have qualia, or phenomenal experiences. Where does the sense of blue and red reside? I see that little light on the camera and it is red. I say it is red. I have no way of proving to you that your sense of red is the same as my sense of red. No way. In fact, if I didn't have eyes, if I were inside a satellite of Jupiter, I think its name is Ganymede, which is covered with ice, and there's a deep ocean, I would never have seen the light of the sun. And in that satellite of Jupiter, there may be life. Imagine now, with your mind, eye, how would life experience itself in such a deep ocean with no sense of seeing red, blue, green, any color. Their qualia will be completely different. Completely different. So my sense of redness is an experience, subjective experience, and I'm sure you have the same experience. And most likely, your sense of red is the same as my sense of red, but there's absolutely no way for me to prove it. So that's a hard problem, phenomenal experience. Dave Chalmers introduced the term hard problem, and then there's the easy problem. The easy problem is because you can solve them. All is required for their solution is to specify a mechanism that performs the function. Ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you that the problem of consciousness is an easy problem. It's only hard when we clock it into concepts and we separate ourselves from fundamental consciousness. And here is where the problem came up. Here is somebody called Isaac Newton. Although I can tell you that if Newton lived today, he would not be Newtonian. And I can say that because I was born as a Christian. If Christ lived today, he probably would not be a Christian. It's okay. I can say that because I'm Christian. You cannot say that as Indians because that would start a religious war. But I can say because I'm Christian. If Christ were lived today, probably he would not be a Christian. Look what happened to the Christian church. Look what happened to Newton. Newton actually wrote a lot more about metaphysics than he wrote about physics. And he called the new science that he was formulating natural philosophy. Natural philosophy. And I think he was right. I think a better term would be philosophy, natural philosophy. But in this Newtonian universe, at the time, they imagined the universe, the mechanism of the universe, was like a complicated clock. The clock up there. We always imagine that the mechanism of the universe is the latest gadget we have invented. So today's latest gadget is a computer. So we're trying to model consciousness out of the computer, the digital computer. But we formulated the computer. We made it. So it looks a little bit silly that we would try to formulate consciousness out of the gadgets that consciousness builds. Contradictory. But anyway, clock. So the laws of the universe are described in terms of Newtonian mechanics as a clock mechanism, which means once you start it going, it starts going on its own. But once you start it going. So here's this whole debate about who started the whole thing. And again, it becomes an external God, a God out there that started the whole thing. Rather than a self-driven universe, which is conscious and drives itself. There's really only two possibilities. Either an external God out there, or the entire thing is self-driven. And I believe the second one. I never liked that external God. Never liked it. It's usually he, by the way. In ancient India, it was the goddess, because she creates. But now, we made him into a male god. Anyway, notice here the big wall. It's a wall. Separates the subject from the object. So in Newtonian physics, there's no role for consciousness, because the object is out there. It's actually fairly schizophrenic if you think about it. Fairly schizophrenic. Because we rely on our senses to view the universe, but then we deny the senses. So what is it? Is it one or the other? We deny the senses. We can say, no, it has to be objectively correct. But we say, the only thing that exists is hard. Sometimes some of my materialist friends, they say, this is hard. And I say, baloney. Quantum theory says it's not hard. It's hard because of qualia, because your sense of subjective experience is tied around electromagnetic processes, electron processes that have to do with atoms and molecules. So that gives you the sense of hardness. But at the superstring level, there's no hardness, there's only vibrations. Vibrations of consciousness. So the hard reality that we call the physical universe, it's actually, in the quantum view, non-existent. The only thing that happens in the quantum world is happenings, haps, events that are rooted in space-time. Oh, space and time. At some point, space and time itself is an experience. We experience time. How do we experience time? Follow me here for this for a little bit. For me to have a sense of direction, I have to have this way or this way. We live in a three-dimensional space, four-dimensional with time, four-dimensional space-time. Time seems to be going from the past into the future. Actually, quantum theory today says that time can go backwards. Particles that go back in time are called antiparticles. They're perfectly okay in quantum field theory. But for me to have a sense of space, I have to have a sense of separation. That is there and I am here. If there's no sense of separation, there's no space. And there's no time. So space and time are not primary. They're secondary. And today in physics, we suspect that even space and time are emergent quantities, although we usually treat them as fundamental. So, in the world of the quantum, something can be a particle and a wave, but not at the same time. This is known as the principle of complementarity. I have written a lot about it in the book, The Conscious Universe. And this complementarity is one of the fundamental principles. Reality is complementary. It looks contradictory. Both aspects need to come in. In this case, the two complementary aspects are the wave and the particle. Complementarity, position and momentum. There are certain variables in physics, in quantum physics, that either they commute or they don't commute. I'm not going to get into the mathematical details. But when they don't commute, you get an uncertainty principle that is defined by Heisenberg's Planck's constant. So it looks fuzzy, but it's a wave. But then when you measure it, it's a particle. It cannot be both a wave and a particle at the same time. It depends on the circumstances of observation. So central to the quantum is the measurement problem, and central to the measurement problem is what Richard Feynman called the two-hole experiment, or the two-slit experiment. You have a source of quanta. There could be electrons, photons. They pass through an opening here, through another screen with two slits, and if they are let alone, you get this interference pattern. In fact, you can send these quanta one at a time. You can send one today, one tomorrow. It will be a long experiment, right? It will take years and years. However, if you do that, you get the interference pattern. So how does the photon that goes through one or the other slit, right? That's what the mind says. Well, it's got to go either through this one or that one. How does it know where to land? So that the next one that comes along lands at the right place. You say, okay, this is nonsense. I'm going to find out exactly through which slit it went through. So I'm going to put a photon detector. Every time it goes through, it will go click. If you do that, the pattern completely changes. It becomes a particle pattern. Complementarity. They don't manifest at the same time. But both aspects are there. So measurement problem is tied to the wave function. Nature of the quantum. These are a lot of words here. We'll go through them fairly fast. Fundamental, and just look at the green part. Fundamental nature of quantum is that it is inherently probabilistic. Inherently. You cannot take away the probabilistic nature of the quantum. Let's say that you have a half-life of a nucleus. Half-life means that in one of those half-lives, 50% of the nucleus will have decayed. Let's say that's 1 day. So in 1 day, half of the nucleus will have decayed to something else. The quantum mechanical equations cannot tell us when a particular event will happen, only the probability that something may happen. So the quantum theory is a probabilistic, inherently probabilistic physics. It's paradoxical because it only makes sense to talk about probabilities if you are going to measure them. Does it make sense to talk about probabilities if you're not going to measure them? So right from the get-go, quantum theory is about measurements. Therefore, observers. Something that classical physics does not have. When you make a measurement, it's not anymore 75% probability, or 50% probability, or 65% probability. It is yes or no. When you look at the radioactive nucleus, it has either decayed or it has not decayed. This is the so-called Schrödinger-Cat paradox. Schrödinger was quite perturbed by that. And of course, as you know, he was a great founder of quantum theory, the wave function. When you make a measurement, the probability of events, instead of being somewhere in the middle, they become either 0 or 100%. If you're measuring, let's say, the stock market, until you observe the stock market index, you say, well, it may go up or it may go down. I don't know. But once, at the end of the day, the stock market is closed, you say, oh, it went up. Now, it's 100% sure that it went up. This is the point. When the measurement takes place, then you have what is known as the collapse of the wave function. But it's not a physical collapse. Please. It's not a physical collapse. It's a collapse in the probability space of something may happen. Then it happens and takes a specific value. The Schrödinger equation, however, it's an equation that gives probabilities evolving smoothly in time. It's a second-order differential equation. In fact, the Schrödinger equation gives linear effects. And this is something big that maybe we'll talk on Friday. The sum, if there's two solutions, the sum of the solutions is also a solution. That's a linear issue. Probabilities of an event occurring. But is the cat awake or is the value? The Schrödinger equation, however, it's an equation that gives probabilities evolving smoothly in time. It's a second-order differential equation. In fact, the Schrödinger equation gives linear effects. And this is something big that maybe we'll talk on Friday. The sum, if there's two solutions, the sum of the solutions is also a solution. That's a linear issue. Probabilities of an event occurring. But is the cat awake or is the cat asleep. I like to use the cat paradox, not as dead or alive, but is it asleep or awake? It's a little bit more humane. In fact, today, we have experiments that show that until a measurement takes place, a nucleus is hovering in the yes and no probability space. It's both. The cat is both asleep and awake until a measurement takes place. In my book, actually, I laugh and say, well, nobody asked the cat. The cat knows whether she is asleep or awake. But anyway, that's another story. Actually, it doesn't really work too well with macroscopic objects. And in fact, Albert Einstein was so perturbed that he said, do you really mean that the moon is not there when nobody is looking at it? He was really addressing Niels Bohr, although he was addressing the question to one of his students. And the answer would be, yes, the moon is not there when nobody is looking. How do we know? I cannot prove it to you. I cannot prove it. But you cannot prove it the other way either. Because it's all wrapped up in consciousness. Now, how do minds enter the picture? As Sir James Jean said, the wave functions are actually knowledge waves. They're not waves, real waves. They're knowledge waves. Go back and read what the original founders of quantum theory said. Somehow today we have created a lot of debates. Something else must be involved when knowledge changes beside physical processes. Something else. And that something else is the mind. You may say, well, why don't you just create a Geiger counter and have the Geiger counter be the observer? John von Neumann said, you can't not do that. Actually, he used a brilliant argument. Please follow this. If the observer were just a purely physical entity, such as the Geiger counter, one could, in principle, write down a bigger wave function that would include the Geiger counter. But then, according to the Schrödinger equation, there would be no collapse. So you're back where you started from. When we talk about observers, we really mean conscious observers with knowledge. A Geiger counter is a tool. It's not a conscious observer that produces knowledge. Therefore, we require the mind. The universe, in its fundamental nature, is a noetic universe. It's either that way or the other way. The other way is the many words interpretation. In the many words interpretation, there's no collapse. The cat is always awake and asleep. When you measure it as awake in your universe, there's another branch of the universe somewhere else where the cat is asleep. And in fact, every time there's a measurement, there's a myriad of paths of yes and no in between. And pretty soon, this universe is filled up with infinite branches that have nothing to do with observers, have nothing to do with acts of observation. It's mind-boggling. Think about it. Mind-boggling. All because, ladies and gentlemen, we don't want to accept the fundamental nature of consciousness playing a role in the observation. It's two choices. Either there's a collapse of the wave function or there's no collapse of the wave function. There's no other choice. So the many words interpretation and its more modern version is not quite the same. I may say some things about that on Friday. The multiverse, there are ways, brilliant ways, to get around the problem of consciousness. Actually, I sort of suspect that there is a multiverse. I like the multiverse. But it should not be an escape route to take consciousness out of the process. Okay. In terms of the aspect experiment, you can wait to the very last nanosecond before making a measurement. And today we can do it because of quantum optics and very precision state experiments. You can wait to the last nanosecond before you make a measurement of the polarization. And you can do it randomly. So there's no way that somehow information passes from one side to the other. You pick a particular direction, the other photon is coupled to the first one. And in fact, if they're separated by light years away, John Archibald Wheeler gave a thought experiment. It could be light years away, you will still have the two photons tied to each other. They are entangled, as we say in quantum theory. Entanglement is a fundamental principle. One of the fundamental principles I'm referring to is complementarity. Another one is entanglement. Another one is non-locality. There's non-locality here. Reality is non-local. But you say, well, come on, this is local. What I do here shouldn't affect things over there. No, it's non-local. It appears as local. The problem is not how to get non-locality from locality. The problem is how do you get locality from non-locality. Reverse it. Not only that, you can make a delayed choice experiment. The past and the future are entangled. We'll talk about it a little bit more on Friday. And this is the actual experiment that shows that. And finally, in quantum field theory, a particle is not a particle. If it's a loop that come out of nowhere, some of them go back in time. These are the so-called Feynman diagrams. Now I'm going to switch to the monistic philosophical systems, because I want to get through some of, I will skip some of this and come down to Kashmir Shavis. This was a great school. We heard a lot yesterday about Vedanta. I would like today to talk a little bit about Shavis. Between around the 9th and 11th century in the Valley of Kashmir. Today, of course, Kashmir, I won't say much about that. It's a big problem, as you know. But back then, it was a great set of philosophical principles that came about by great masters, Ramana, Vasuguptacharya, Utpaladeva, Kalata, Bhaskara, Somananda, Vivanagupta, perhaps the greatest Shaivite, and Kshamaraja, the greatest disciple of Vivanagupta of the 11th century. They talked about the principles of manifestation. And for example, the Shiva Sutras, the first Shiva Sutra, which was revealed to Vasuguptacharya, it says Chaitanyam Atma. Very simple. Chaitanyam Atma. What does Chaitanyam Atma mean? The self is consciousness. Chaitanya is the light of consciousness. Atma is the self. It says the self is Chaitanya. It's luminous awareness. Chaitanya Atma. You can write books after books on the first sutra of Kashmir Shavis, Shiva Sutra, revealed to Vasuguptacharya, that says the self is consciousness. Vijnana Bhairava. This is a great set of writings that actually refers to practical exercise, including breathing. We won't do that today. I want to get to Pradibhyajna Hridayam. Pradibhyajna Hridayam means self-recognition. It was authored by Kshamaraja, disciple of Vivanagupta. It means recognition. There's 20 sutras. And today we'll try to cover just 5 of them. It's a practical guide to achieve a self-awareness life as well as a great philosophy. The great things about these ancient monistic systems, they were not abstract philosophies. They were philosophies that had to do with the master, passing on that information through practical means to experience what the philosophical systems were saying. More or less as you do here at the EI, right? You have both. You have the practical and the philosophical. So, Sutra number 1. I will use the Sanskrit terms. I don't use those very much in the West, but in India, we should use the Sanskrit terms because they have their own power. They have their own Chaitanya. So, the first sutra says, Chidhi Svatantra Visva Chidhi Heditu. Chiti, which is consciousness. Svatantra, absolutely free, independent. Vishva, it's a universe. Siddhi means power and accomplishment. Hedetu, the cause. It means universal consciousness in her infinite freedom brings about the attainment of the universe. Or, another way to interpret it, the universe is a means to attain the realization of supremely free universal consciousness. In other words, by looking at the universe, you can reverse it and say, oh, that's universal consciousness. Or, supremely independent universal consciousness is the cause of manifestation, maintenance, and reabsorption of the universe, the siddhi of the universe, the powers of the universe. We, as Chidi, can also be free of circumstances. Because remember, we are also Chidi. Chidi is not she out there. She is in each one of us. So, Chidi is Svatantra, Vishva, Siddhi, Hedetu. It gives the highest. The first sutra gives the highest. It says, everything is universal consciousness. Period. Including all of us. Sutra number 2. How does she do it? Remember, now I switch from you because Chidi is also Shiva. At that point, the male and female become one. The cosmic dance of Paramashiva is creation, sustenance, destruction. There are actually 2 other aspects, the grace and the concealment. To have concealment, you need grace. To have grace, you need concealment. Remember, the dance. If you look at the dance of a quantum, the 3 first functions of Paramashiva are there. The dance of the proton. 10 more minutes. I'll go through very fast. Sutra number 2. Svechaya Svabitau Vishvam Unmiliyati. Sva, own. Ichaya, by her will. Bitau, on a part of mirrors. Vishvam, again universe. Unmilayati, causes to appear. How does she create the universe? On herself, as part of herself, she projects in her own consciousness the appearance of an object. By the power of her own will, she unfolds the universe upon a part of herself, or another way to interpret it, by the power of her own will, she, Chidi, unfolds the universe upon her own screen, i.e. in herself as the base of the universe. Our nature is both transcendent and immanent. That's the conclusion of this. We're both transcendent and immanent beings. In fact, Abhivana Gupta says, just as in a mirror reflection, a town or a village appears as an image that is not separate from them, yet it appears as separate, and each separate from the other as well as from the mirror. Similarly, the universe appears differentiated as one thing is from another, and as well is differentiated from the awakened consciousness of Bhairava. Most pure, though that difference too is not real. It's a reflection of the mirror. In some ways, I like to kid around. The universe is smoke and mirror. The universe is just smoke and mirror. The play of universal consciousness. Universal consciousness projects itself on itself, appears as an object, and says, oh, I am different. By projection, then she gains the experience of the other. If you don't have projection, you cannot have the experience of the other. Sutra number 3. Tan Nana Anurupa Grahaya Grahaka Vedat. Tat, that. Nana, diverse. Anurupa, reciprocally adopting. Grahya, subject perceiver. Vedat, because of divisions. How does she do it? Becomes diversified because of the division of reciprocally adopted objects and subjects. Complementarity enters at that level, begins to complement by projection, and then creates the appearance of the object. Division arises in the interchange between objects and subjects. The other, the object, is really me, the subject. Although it appears as separate from me, through a mutual relation between the two. So the quantum says the same thing. Object, subject, and process linking the two. That's why quantum theory is so important. And that's why we can make the link with monistic schools. I believe the only way to make the link with monistic schools is through quantum theory and its future evolution. Because there will be a future evolution of quantum theory. Sutra number 4, because I want to get to number 5. We can skip that. Sutra number 4. Chiti samkontantma chanopi samkuchita vishma maya. Again, by now you know that Vishwa is the universe. Chiti, you know, is consciousness. Choka is contraction. She contracts her essential nature, the one who is Chiti, even though in the contracted nature she's still cheating. In other words, even an individual whose nature is consciousness in a contracted state embodies the universe in a contracted form. The universe is in us. By studying ourselves, we can study the universe. By studying the universe, we can study ourselves. The universe is in me, I am the universe, or I am in the universe. And as another Shiva Sutra says, as here, so elsewhere. So these 36 levels that, in fact, Abhivana Gupta talked about, they have 7 perceivers. The 7th is us, embodied souls. It's a play always between the aham and the idam. I am and this. Consciousness becomes the experiencing subjects, and levels of reality are tied into qualia. Deepak Chopra, myself, and Rudy Tanzi, we are actually now exploring qualia, and probably Deepak and I will talk about that on Friday, Saturday. These are the 36 levels of manifestation. I'll probably say a little bit more about that on Friday. Basically, the first 5 levels is the Paramashiva. Is the object has not yet arisen. Here in what is called as the Maya, which is the clocks, it takes on limitations. Remember, through these principles I was talking about. Eventually we get to the ego over here, and down on this 36th level is the physical universe. It's manifestation out of Paramashiva that has really 3 main powers. Icha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, and Kriya Shakti. Icha Shakti is the energy of the will. Jnana Shakti is the energy of knowledge. And Kriya Shakti is the energy of action. Universal consciousness can act, can has knowledge, and has will. We humans can act, have knowledge, and we have will. But they're limited. As human beings, we think, oh, I am small, I can only do this, I cannot do that. That's when we took cloaks of limitations, put them around us, and now we see ourselves as limited beings down to this level. So usual reductionist science starts from here, trying to get up there. No way. It's the other way around. It's manifestation coming down. Is the universe a gigantic brain? Remember, as here so elsewhere. In fact, now they're beginning to see that the brain cell looks like galaxies, filaments connecting galaxies. Very, very weird, actually. I'm not sure if I'll go that far, but there's some people that say that maybe the galaxies are neurons in a universal brain. It just looks the same. Okay. Sutra number 5. Chiri eva chaitanya padat avaruda chetya samprachini chittam. Chiti, universal consciousness. Eva itself, chaitanya, expanded consciousness. Padat, from the stage, avaruda, descended. Chetya, perceivable objects. Samprachini, contracted. Chitta, mind. There it is. The mind is nothing else than universal consciousness contracted by taking on the properties of the object. The mind takes on the properties of the perceived object. Becomes the mind. But actually the mind is cheating. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the 5th sutra, and I will stop there. Understand what the mind is. Your mind is your greatest friend and is your greatest enemy. It will drive you crazy. So many problems in today's society. Why? We take the drugs, we take this, we take that. We don't understand the nature of the mind. Say, my mind makes me go crazy. The mind is Chaitanya. Understand what the mind is. When you understand your mind, it's a very important sutra. It holds the key to freedom. Don't fight the mind. Don't fight it. Universal consciousness. She will beat you to the ground. Accept your mind as your own universal consciousness. What the mind thinks, that he becomes. Observe the mind. Understand the mind as pure consciousness. Allow it to go wherever it wants, but don't act on it. Just don't act on every little crazy thought that your mind brings. Understand that it's just a wave in an infinite ocean of consciousness. The mind creates duality, but it's still blissful consciousness. My mind is my greatest friend. If I understand the nature of my mind, I can be my own psychoanalyst. And psychoanalysts will have no jobs. Understand your own mind, you can be your own therapist. And finally, once you understand your mind and truly experience it, you are free. Thank you.
Earlier slides you told that qualia happens in the sub-quantum plane. Do you stick to that? Or explain, you want to explain that? Qualia?
Yeah, in fact, the sub-quantum level is, time is not a reason yet. Space and time is not a reason. In fact, in superstring theory, they would believe that time itself, the question of, was there a time before the Big Bang? Conventional cosmology said that question is meaningless, but in fact, in superstring theory, you can talk about it. And in fact, I think what Roger Penrose has come up now with the CCC theory is actually a much better version, as far as I'm concerned, than the multiverse or the many worlds interpretation, because there, at least, it keeps the memory of the previous cycle. And that's a way for him to account for this 10 to the 40 factors, these coincidences, so-called coincidences. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but basically, time itself and space are emergent quantities at the sub-quantum level, below the Planck level.
Agreed. But question is that means by quantum mechanics we cannot explain qualia. We have to go.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We have to go deeper to
absolutely, yes. In fact, we have an article with Deepak and Rudy Tanzi that we call it from quanta to qualia. We got to go from quanta to qualia.